get their readings over the weekend in order to complete quiz 10, the final quiz. I don't hear anyone going, yes, yes, I did. Miss Bliss.
Of course I did.
Oh, good for you. Are your fingers crossed? Well, look at that. I got the split screen working. We're going to have one last week where everything functions, more or less. Except before you guys showed up, it took about 20 minutes for the lights to turn on. There's always something. Okay, what I'm going to do this morning, what we're doing is focusing on getting ready for the final from this point onward. There's also that last quiz that's due in on Wednesday, which will also help you get ready for the final to some extent. So I'm going to kind of review some of the things that we talked about when we were talking about Reconstruction. And I'm going to start with the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Let me get this slide fixed up so you can, there you go. October 1863 is when he wrote it. See if it'll show up. There it is, plus its little heart. We also call that the 10% plan. That's an easier name to write and spell, so a lot of people like that. The only reason they call it the 10% plan was that part of the offer he was making to forgive the South was if 10% of the people in your state who could vote in 1860 swear their allegiance to the Union and accept the emancipation of the slaves, they can have their property returned to them, except of course slaves, and that you can begin planning to re-enter the Union as a state. We talked about the much more harsh suggestion of the radical Republicans, the ironclad oath, total transformation of Southern society, and immediate full votes and full rights of citizenship for freed slaves. Some of those points are pretty good points. The ironclad oath would make it impossible for anyone, for sufficient people in the South, to swear their allegiance to get them back into the Union until after one generation of people had died off. So that's a pretty tough requirement. And Lincoln, of course, treated that with the pocket veto. We talked enough about the pocket veto, where he just didn't take action on it, and Congress went out of session, so the veto disappeared, or so the bill disappeared. House of Representatives, the Senate's already passed it. House of Representatives passes the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Now it goes out to the states for ratification. It will be ratified in December of 1865, so Abraham Lincoln will be dead by the time that happens. This is what freed the slaves. In terms of law and all that, slavery was made illegal by the 13th Amendment. Nothing before that freed the slaves except small laws that allowed captured slaves or captured property to be confiscated by the government during the war. But that only freed slaves on a kind of a spot-by-spot basis. 13th Amendment is what does the job. In 1865, also the Freedmen's Bureau was established, pushed through Congress by the President to help freed slaves. What are they going to do once they're free? Where are they going to work? Do they need legal representation? Can they buy property? Can they get health care? Can they get a job, some of them? Also talked about the assassination of Lincoln by John Wilkes Booth. And he was followed, the president, by Andrew Johnson, who's from Tennessee. Self-educated guy, 57 years old, started out as a tailor, moved from South Carolina to Tennessee, and then got into politics, state representative, state senator, U.S. representative, governor of Tennessee Territory, U.S. Senate, provisional governor, again, actually was the governor of Tennessee before they seceded as well. He's the only member of the Senate to remain loyal to the Union during the war, from the southern states. Political views of Reconstruction, the same as Lincoln's, with one exception. Anyone with a large amount of taxable property, in this case they say it's $20,000, that doesn't make sense to you or me, because that's like a down payment on your pickup truck nowadays. Back then it was a lot of money. And he very, very much resented plantation owners because he considered them guilty of getting the South into the Civil War. You could, even if you were a plantation owner, if you applied for pardon directly to the President of the United States, you could get a pardon. He wasn't really strong on black franchise. He wasn't really, the rights for African Americans to vote. He wasn't very strong on civil rights in general. The South's attitude, total defiance. Well, pretty much total defiance. They broke all the rules. They were told if you become a state, you can't send a former Southern official to Congress, either Senate or House of Representatives. They did so anyway. In the case of Georgia, and the way that Georgia finagled around with their legislative body at first, Georgia is going to be readmitted to the Union and then kicked back out again until they straighten things out. The black codes, you guys got, there's the radicals. The Bourbon Democrats, basically businessmen, didn't really have an iron in the fire as far as civil rights were concerned, didn't oppose having education for freedmen. Then the Redeemers, who wanted to go back, they're probably the ones who passed all the black codes. which were basically set up to do what? To always make people of color subordinate to white people, and to also guarantee that they always had workers on their farms, even if they weren't, quote, slaves, end quote. Now in your readings it says one thing a little bit, and this thing it says something else, but pretty much it's the same thing if you think about it, and that is all of these black codes, most of them, while there was still military down in the southern states, while the Freedmen's Bureau was still active and under the control of the military, in most of those states, they threw out the black codes, but I think the black codes were still followed in the South anyway. You have to differentiate between them and something that will happen that we'll talk about next semester, the Jim Crow laws. A little bit different. Some of them are exactly the same. There's a lot of violence in the South almost immediately. The next midterm election, there'll be violence in Mississippi, I think in Louisiana, trying to prevent black people from voting, trying to prevent Republicans from maintaining control of the state, because at that time, to most people, Republicans were pro-Reconstruction and Democrats were against Reconstruction. Obviously, that's not true with every person, but that was pretty much the rule of the game. And they had the Ku Klux Klan until it gets wiped out, the White League, the Red Shirts, the Knights of the White Camellia down in Louisiana. They always have to be romantic about their evil. And slowly but surely, throughout the period of Reconstruction, slowly but surely, all of the states will go Democrat. And slowly but surely, that early, heavy black representation in the South will start to fizzle away under pressure from all the racially oriented Southern white people. We listed 3 Reconstruction amendments: 13th, prohibiting slavery; 14th, how to put this, constitutionally defining citizenship. For the first time, where the Constitution actually got pretty specific about what citizenship was, in the 14th Amendment. It also had teeth to punish any state that tried to prevent people from enjoying all of their rights. And they repudiated the Southern debt. We talked about that enough, I think, last time. The 15th Amendment re-emphasizes the fact that everyone has the right to vote that's a citizen, and it prohibits the denial of franchise, that's denial of the right to vote, because of race, color, or past servitude explicitly prohibited. And I will add something that's not there on the book. Some of the women's rights fighters voted against this amendment, and some of them even voted against the 14th Amendment. Why? Because it didn't specifically mention women. Other women believed that it didn't matter, the general principle was there, so women were included anyway. It depended on how you read it. That goes way back to when we were still fighting for abolition of slavery, when people like William Lloyd Garrison interpreted the Constitution as protecting slavery. But the 15th Amendment guarantees the right to vote. After all those black codes, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that made everyone born in the U.S. and not subject to any foreign power citizens. It was aimed at the freedmen. It mentioned somebody else that's not on this slide. Oh, maybe it is. No, it's not. It excluded Indians who were not taxed. What does that mean? American Indians who were assimilated into white society, did business, lived, and paid taxes and all of that the way anyone would. But Indians who chose to live on the reservation in their communal groups didn't pay tax. And so they're excluded from citizenship. And when you read the wording, Everyone born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power. What does that mean? Can you figure out what the significance is there? Who do we have living in our country who is not subject to our laws? But they're legally living in our country. They're legally living in our country. I'm not talking about illegal aliens. That's a whole different kettle of fish. Diplomats. Diplomats have diplomatic immunity. They're not subject to American laws. And so their children, just because they happen to be stationed here, if their kids are born here, that doesn't give them American citizenship. 14th Amendment leaves Congress in June of 1866. It's going to take about a year or so for it to get ratified, and all of the southern states that still weren't back in the Union are told if you want to get back in the Union, you have to vote for ratification. At first they didn't, then they saw the light and they did. In 1866, there was a midterm election, at which time the Republicans really got full control of everything in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And because they were angry at the South for the black codes and that sort of business, all of the Republicans, even the more moderate ones, started to become more radical. So when the dust had settled after the election of 1866, the radicals controlled a little bit over 77% of the of Congress. And you realize only a 2/3 vote is required to overturn a veto, so they've got that in hand easily. We talked about the Reconstruction Acts, the 3 acts that were passed, that were vetoed by the President, passed over his veto. Military Reconstruction Act sets up the format for using the Army to rebuild the South. Command of the Army Act, which was intended to limit the President's control over this, and the Tenure of Office Act, which was also to limit the President's control and to keep him from being able to fire Edwin Stanton, who was at that time the Secretary of War, and very, very pro-radical Republican. 14th Amendment is finally ratified on the 9th of July in 1868. Of course, President Johnson was angry about the Tenure of Office Act, tried to get around it, tried to fire Edwin Stanton, and he was impeached on 11 counts, I think, on 11 articles, what they call, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, end quote. The definition of that is a little bit out there in left field somewhere, and they still argue about what the definition of that is. He was acquitted in March of 1868. From that point on, he did not stick his nose into Reconstruction. He got the message. th Amendment will get through Congress in 1869. It will be ratified in 1870. And in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant is elected president, so he becomes president when? In March of 1869. 18th President of the United States, former commanding general of the Army. That's the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. They're celebrating the meeting of the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific in 1869. By the way, they almost missed each other. They had an argument about where the map said they were supposed to go, and so eventually they had to relay some tracks so that the two railroads met. 15th Amendment will be ratified, as I mentioned, in February 1870. In 1870 also, and we talked about this, I know, but I'm going to talk about it again, Congress started passing enforcement acts to urge the President to take action against some of the organizations like the Ku Klux Klan in states like South Carolina, Mississippi. The first act was passed in 1870. It protected black votes. It reemphasized what the 14th Amendment or the 15th Amendment talks about, but it was a practical sort of protection of black votes. Another one provided federal supervision of Southern elections, federal elections in the South, just to make sure that they don't even have a chance of going wrong. And finally, because those two weren't good enough, in 1871, they'll pass an act. It's also an enforcement act. Some people call it the Ku Klux Klan Act. It doesn't mention the Ku Klux Klan, but it describes it pretty much to a T. And it says this kind of organization is illegal and the president may use military force. He can declare martial law, suspend habeas corpus, put people in jail, whatever it takes to deal with this. And he did in South Carolina. He made South Carolina his example. He sent the army in there, declared martial law, suspended habeas corpus, and started locking up Klan leaders and putting some of them in jail. It pretty much broke the Klan, such as it was. It wasn't much of an organization anyway. There was groups of people that weren't really coordinated or anything like that. So they'll stop calling themselves the Klan, but you still have other organizations. The Democratic Party in Mississippi had a group called the Red Shirts, whose main job was to urge Republicans to leave the state. I'm sure it was all by gentle persuasion. Several people died from it. There were riots in Mississippi, all connected with this. Knights of the White Camellia were active in parts of Louisiana, etc. Grant's Attorney General, Amos Ackerman, was really, really good. I lost his name off the slide. I had to go look it up a minute ago. Not a very impressive looking gentleman, but apparently he had bulldog tenacity, and he was a pretty good legal lawyer and principal, and he went after the Klan and groups like that in the South and was quite successful. Even so, in 1873, we'll have the Colfax Massacre, or the Southerners like to call it the Colfax Riot, in which somewhere in the vicinity of 150 freedmen were killed. It all had to do with a disputed election and black people meeting together in the Colfax courthouse and being surrounded by white militia from that county and from other counties. Gunfire broke out, and it seemed like mainly all black people died. The South, by the way, went immediately into denial of this. They put a plaque up about the Colfax riot and told the story in a totally different way. Eventually the truth came out, and I think in the last 10 years or so that plaque's been torn down and a new plaque has been put up. Now, 1875, and this we didn't mention last time, I don't think, or maybe we did, they passed another Civil Rights Act. Charles Sumner put it together with Representative Benjamin Butler, former general, the guy that was in New Orleans, signed into law by President Grant on the 1st of March, 1875. Eventually, the Supreme Court's going to throw it out. But basically, it's very similar to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 about discrimination in public places, on public transportation, and that sort of thing. It took from when it was thrown out in 1883 until 1964 to fix it. That's an awful long time. And all through that time, civil rights went downhill, not uphill. No improvement. The court case that came out of the Louisiana massacre, United States versus Cruikshank. I want you to remember that one. United States versus Cruikshank. The Supreme Court finds that the 14th Amendment
only pertains to the action of states. The wording, if you read the 14th Amendment, no state may infringe on the rights of individuals. And the court said, so this gives individuals the power to protect them against state action, but it has nothing to do with the actions of individuals. And so they threw that case out, and the people that led the Colfax massacre walked away free. We talked a little bit about corruption in government. I want you to remember, pay attention. I'll just tell you the name of a scandal. I'll show you the name of the scandal. All I want you to remember, Credit Mobilier is a scandal involving two things: corruption in the board of directors of the Union Pacific Railroad and bribery of congressmen so that they wouldn't investigate it. The actual criminal action started back when Lincoln was still alive, but it carried through until Grant was president. And for that reason, he's often blamed for it. The fact of the matter is, he had to clean it up. This is all left from the disorganization of the war and that sort of thing, where people were concentrating on fighting the war and weren't paying attention to what they considered at the time to be the small stuff. So there were a lot of war profiteers, people who did things for the government, sold things to the government, whatever, in an illegal manner or in a fraudulent manner. Another one I want you to remember is Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was the Democratic Party political machine in New York City. It started out in the 1700s. It lasted until the 1900s, well into the 1900s. During the last years of the Civil War and immediately after it, Tammany Hall was run by William Mager Tweed. They called him Boss Tweed. And he was almost untouchable. Then there was the gold scandal, where James Fisk and Jay Gould tried to corner all the gold on the gold market, and finally President Grant found out about it and blocked them. It also involved a corrupt general who got a job in the United States Treasury by the name of Daniel Butterfield. That's a sad thing. He was a brave general, had the Medal of Honor, but when the war was over, he kind of drifted the wrong way. Sometimes war does that to your mind. Then there was the whiskey ring. Remember that one? Started by an Internal Revenue Service, or a Department of Internal Revenue, Department of Treasury at that time, inspector who took bribes from liquor manufacturers to underreport the amount of liquor they were producing. It's going to spread from St. Louis, that's where it started. The fellow's name was McDonald. I was looking for his full name. John A. McDonald. It's going to spread all the way to the East Coast. President Grant's private secretary, and now probably would be called Chief of Staff, Orville Babcock, was implicated in this. Grant saved him from going to jail, but subsequently he fired him. Finally, we have the impeachment of William Belknap, who was the Secretary of War. He was impeached for taking bribes to give people positions as the chiefs of trading posts on Indian reservations, because then they could rip off federal money that was sent out there ostensibly to feed the Indians. And there was a lot of that going on. Something we didn't talk about was the fact that foreign affairs, I don't have a lot about him here, but while the President of the United States is busy fighting a civil war, not only does he have to worry about the economy and other things like that, but he has to worry about our foreign relations. Of course, Lincoln was always paying attention to Britain and France, lest they come into the war on the side of the Confederates. But there were other issues too. When Grant became president, he appointed a guy named Hamilton Fish to be his Secretary of State. Fish had to get along with the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you probably recognize him. He's Charles Sumner, the guy that got beat up in the Senate. Very much a radical Republican. He's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. One of the things Grant wanted to do, for a number of reasons, was to take over, one way or another, the place that they called back then Santo Domingo. Actually, nowadays we call it the Dominican Republic. He wanted a port there for our Navy to operate. He was concerned because of the other European countries who had their nose stuck into the Caribbean, contrary to the Monroe Doctrine, and he wanted to kind of get there first to stop them from doing that. Now, Spain already had Cuba and Puerto Rico. The British had some islands. He didn't want that to grow. That was one thing. Another thing, a lot of American businessmen wanted their feet on the ground in the Dominican Republic because they had natural resources, very precious natural resources. He also viewed it, and this is a little bit subtle, he viewed it as a place that American freed slaves could go to, not because he wanted to push them out of the country, but if they had the opportunity to go and live in the Dominican Republic, right next door to a country that kicked out all their European masters, Haiti, if they had the opportunity to go there, then the American plantation owners would have to treat black people a little bit more courteously to keep them working for them. This was the way his mind worked. It was kind of a strategy game. Offer them the opportunity to go somewhere else to make the people over here be nicer to them. He actually had a treaty drawn up, drafted by the Secretary of State, by Mr. Fish. It was all ready to be presented to Congress, but the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and some of his allies in Congress didn't want it to be done. So they blocked it. So he never got his wish on that. He also had to put up with these guys up along our northern border. They were Irishmen, anti-English, and they were using our border to hide behind and then launch raids against the British Army up in Canada. They were called the Fenians. That could have caused a war with us in Britain, but we kind of shut that down. We prevented them from doing that. Then there was the Treaty of Washington. We're trying to arbitrate with the British when we're angry with them about something instead of going to war. There was a Confederate raider ship called the Alabama. It was built in England and it was allowed to hide out in some British ports. And he would go out and attack American merchant ships. It was causing our government economic trouble. And instead of pounding our fist on the table and demanding that the British pay us back all the losses, we went to international arbitration. I cannot remember who the arbitrators were. And we ended up winning $15.5 million settlement out of that, which, as I keep saying, in that time, $15.5 million was probably a higher number than anyone could count. It was a lot of money. Also over in Cuba, there's a local, a native uprising, probably a lot of people from outside the country trying to support it, including an American ship which was leased. crewed with Americans and Brits, and they were bringing arms and supplies to the rebels. They were captured by the Spanish Navy, and the Spanish started hanging the crewmen of the ship. Secretary Fish quickly intervened, made some threats. The British also did, because some of their citizens were involved. And Spain's going to end up backing down. They're going to return the ship to the United States. We'll undertake not to allow the ship to interfere with Spain. And Spain will pay cash damages, if you want to call it. It's an indemnity, is what they call it technically, to the families of the Americans who were already executed before Fish could stop that. Another big thing we're going to have is a treaty called the Burlingame Treaty. We sign it with China. We have a lot of Chinese immigrants. They came to escape from the Opium Wars. They came to join in on the California Gold Strike. They came to escape from the Taiping Rebellion, which killed something in the vicinity of 20 million people. They don't do things small over there. They worked in the coal mines for probably less money than a white person would work for. But to regularize their immigration, we signed a treaty with China, which gave us access to China and China access to our country. That's back in 1868. Eventually, we're going to break that treaty. Okay. There's the guy that broke Boss Tweed, put him in jail. Governor of New York, 1874, Samuel J. Tilden. He was actually, I think, the Attorney General for New York when he brought Boss Tweed down. Now, the big issues. In 1876, the biggest issue for the Republicans was corruption. I mean, the Democrats were harping away at the corruption in the Republican government, and the more moderate Republicans were doing the same thing. They were complaining about the corruption. The president was still a rock star. Everybody loved Grant, except the people who ran against him for office, I guess. But around him, there was a lot of corruption going on. And this is in the minds of the Republicans, and although Grant was popular enough to be reelected a third time, the Republicans decided to find a new nominee. And they're going to pick a guy by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, to be fair to Grant on this corruption charge, I don't think Grant ever made any money from corruption. When people tried to send him gifts and bribes and things like that, they were mailed back at the least. He also created a civil service system to try and keep the civil service from being corrupt. What's a civil service? What's the civil service? They're all the government civilian employees. And a lot of congressmen and people like that use their influence to get jobs for their friends, for people that voted for them or gave them political support, or even gave them money. And by setting up the commission, Grant was trying to stop that. The problem was Congress would never appropriate enough money for the Civil Service Commission to work. Congressmen didn't want it to work. Trades opened up pretty much with the South. A guy from the New York Tribune we've heard of before, Horace Greeley, is writing about the corruption a lot. Grant won his second term in '72. That's not going to happen again because he's not going to run again. There are other issues, by the way, that were being argued about while Grant was still president. One of them was, how do we pay our debts? We ran up gigantic debts during the war. And Grant's feeling was, kind of the old-fashioned feeling about money, we have to pay our debts in full, in gold, so that we don't lose our reputation with the rest of the world. There were a lot of bonds out there that had to be paid off. There was a lot of paper money. Grant wanted to buy back all the paper money. Gradually. He wanted to do it all at once. We didn't have that much money. Racial issues continue to come back up. In 1873, 3 years before this election, some railroads start to fail. The bonds that the railroad sold, just like our city bonds, the bonds that the railroad sold came due and they couldn't pay them off. So some railroads went under, some of the banks that lent them money went under as a result, and we began to have a depression. Another reason why some people weren't happy with the Grant administration. By 1874, the Democrats were already in control of the House of Representatives. Big change from radical Republican days. They want to keep circulating paper money. Grant doesn't want to do that. They pass a bill to create more paper money. Grant vetoes the bill, and they can't override his veto. He vetoes the bill 2 times because they kept passing it. He also calls for gradual redemption of paper money. In other words, buying back the paper money. But by the 1876 election, almost all the states in the South were Democratic. By that time, they'd passed that Civil Rights Act of 1875. By that time, Crookshank versus the United States is over with. In the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, 3 times governor of Ohio, was going to run for president. He's going to run against Samuel Tilden, the Democratic former governor of New York, former lawyer. I guess he was still a lawyer. The guy that brought down Boss Tweed, so he's kind of famous. They really didn't talk about any major issues. They didn't talk about money, whether to buy back the paper money or anything like that. The South was old-time people leading it now, very conservative, not particularly interested in civil rights. There was some civil service reform. There were 2 terms that you heard all the time. When the Democrats were campaigning against the Republicans, they kept talking about dirty linen. They're talking about the Republicans. By the way, linen was also, it wasn't just for bedspreads then. Linen was people used about underwear too. But dirty linen was corruption. And on the other hand, the Republicans were doing what they called waving the bloody shirt. That all comes from the story of a Republican guy who got beat up by the Knights of the White Camellia or some group like that down south to intimidate him and to run him out of the South. And his shirt was covered with blood, and some congressman got what he claimed was that shirt and actually physically carried it to the halls of Congress and waved it around in congressional session. So those are the 2 accusations. The South, one of the other things that they say quietly that has nothing to do with corruption is, if you keep voting for Republicans, before long, black people will be in control of the entire South. That's a subtle argument. I mean, they whispered that one. They didn't say that one out loud in the halls of Congress. The North, the funny thing about racial issues in the North, and you can read about it in the readings, slowly but surely the people in the North just got tired of the whole subject and wanted to get back to normal life and didn't want to talk about those things anymore. So on the one hand, the support for radical Republicans is fading in their own party, and on the other hand, Southerners, especially in the South and Southern elections, are going to ask people if they want African Americans in control of their states. Tilden is going to win the popular vote by 300,000 votes. He's going to win, at least on first count, 184 to Rutherford B. Hayes' 165 electoral votes. But the Republicans are claiming 19 votes from the states of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, and actually even a 20th vote from out west. The Republicans claim that those electoral votes should have gone to Rutherford B. Hayes and not to Tilden, because all three of those states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, actually sent two groups of electors. So, which group do you believe? To settle the issue, Congress got together and decided to form a commission, a congressional commission. They call it an electoral commission. It's going to have 15 members. Listen to the makeup now. 15 members. 5 of them, or rather 7 of them, will be Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1, in theory, the chairman, will be neutral. Where did they get them? 5 members came from the Senate. They were Republicans. 5 members came from the House of Representatives. They were Democrats. 5 members, or 4 plus 1 if you want, came from the Supreme Court. 4 members were sitting justices on the Supreme Court. One of them was supposed to be neutral. He tended to lean in the direction of the Democrats. His name was David Davis. He was from Illinois. It looked like maybe this election would go Democratic. And suddenly, mysteriously out of the woodwork, come a few gentlemen from Illinois who come down to promise David Davis they can get him elected, they can make him governor of Illinois. And Davis walks out on the commission to go become governor of Illinois. Now, you got to replace him with another man from the Supreme Court. Guess what? They didn't have any more pro-democratic justices. So the guy that replaced David Davis is a pro-Republican, which shifts the vote, and the vote goes 8 for Rutherford B. Hayes, 7 for Samuel Tilden, and Congress votes the same way, 185 to 184 in favor of Hayes. So in theory, now Hayes is president. But the members of Congress, especially the Republicans, didn't want to look too phony. So they went to the Southerners and said, okay, you've lost. To the Democrats in general, but mainly the Southerners. Okay, you've lost. Now that you see you've lost, why don't you make it unanimous in favor of Mr. Hayes, so that the people don't feel we have a divided country? And the Southerners said, that's more than we dare do if we have to go home and explain it to our constituents. We didn't get anything out of this deal. So the Republicans promise. It's called the Compromise of 1877. They promise they will withdraw all the remaining federal troops from the South, which wasn't a hard promise to make, because the only place they had federal troops anymore were in Florida and Louisiana. And they cost money to keep there, so they were more than happy to pull them out. They promised to support to rebuild the levees along the Mississippi River, the levees that kept the river from flooding, wiping out farms. They promised to build another transcontinental railroad, which passed through the South. The original transcontinental railroad, the Union Pacific and the Continent, and the and the Central Pacific Railroad, all ran through Northern Territory. They also promised, we'll give you a cabinet position. One Democrat gets on the president's cabinet. And they give him the position of Postmaster General. You might laugh at that. That's a stupid job. Who wants to be Postmaster General? It was highly politically significant because the Postmaster General was in the position to give away more jobs than any member of the President's cabinet. If you can give away jobs, you get votes. So it turns out it was a pretty powerful position at that time. So that's how it is. They more or less shake hands. They do it at a place called Wormley House, which is no longer standing in Washington, D.C. Shook hands. Oh, the Democrats had to promise one other thing, that they would vote for James A. Garfield to be the Speaker of the House. He, of course, was a Republican. And that, my friends, with about 3 minutes to go in the class, is the end of Reconstruction and the end of this semester. So we're done with any new material. Next class, oh, if I can do this without falling asleep at the wheel or something, I will present you with keywords. And we will spend Wednesday and Friday trying to get ready for the exam. We're going to do the exam a week from Wednesday. Same time, same place. In this room. You guys bring your computers. Please. I could conclude by about 1876 rather, just before this election, the United States is patting themselves on the back. They've been through the Civil War. They've solved a lot of problems. They seem to be solved anyway. They have a giant, what we'd call nowadays a world fair. It was called the Philadelphia Expo. Over a number of months that it was there, about 10 million people attended it, including kings and potentates from all around the world. It covered something like 284 acres of land right in Philadelphia. They had expositions of our technology, electrical generation, giant steam engines. Machinery Hall was probably the most popular place. Everyone went to visit. They had a Corliss steam engine there, 70 feet tall, weighing 650 tons. It powered 13 acres of machinery in the Great Hall. 30,000 exhibits of arts, manufacturers, products, agricultural products, mining products. Department of the Interior created an exhibit on American Indians. They had Indian village with all different kinds of Indian habitations on it. Sounded like everything was going hunky-dory dandy. But things were going on out west that we can talk about next semester. In fact, during the expo, the Philadelphia Expo, a telegram is received at the expo saying that General Custer and the 7th Cavalry have been destroyed by the Sioux at the Little Bighorn. We can start out next semester talking about that. Okay, guys. Have a good day. Study. Almost there.
Mr. Hunt,
Yes.
is there any way that you could send us that thing that we just went over?
What, the notes that you mean the PowerPoint you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I will stick it in notes and reading.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay,
When is quiz 10 due?
Wednesday. Did you hear that?
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.